Hi, I'm Dan Olsen. We just wrapped up another great lean product meetup here. Tonight's guest was Box Chief Product Officer Jeetu Patel. He gave an awesome talk on his 10 lessons for how to scale your product. It was a great list. You'll see in the video. A couple of them I really like. Focus on the problem. That's his number one tip. And also that retention is really important. Those are concepts that I really like a lot. But he gave a lot of examples, and then we had lots of Q&A. You'll see that there was a lot of Q&A from the audience. He shared a lot of his thoughts and wisdom and examples and advice, and I think you'll enjoy it. So he definitely knows what he's talking about. I love it because I actually worked with Box back in 2007 with the founding team, and so it's great to see what they've been able to do. Obviously, a huge success. And I think you get a little insight into why when you hear Jeetu and him sharing his pearls of wisdom about product. And so if you enjoy the video, be sure to subscribe to our channel, like it, comment it, and hope you enjoy it. Thanks.
So what I thought we'd do is firstly, thank you for having me here. I work at Box like Dan was mentioning, and we tend to do these quite often because it's actually quite a learning experience even for us as questions get answered and we have a dialogue. So thanks for hosting me over here. What I thought I'd do is we'd break this into two sections. The second part is going to be far more interesting than the first part. But the first part is I'll actually walk you through a few lessons that I've learned in product in Silicon Valley. I've been here for a little shy of a decade. And then after that, what I thought we'd do is just open it up to Q&A on anything. So I'll try to set some context, but you can go as you can ask about Box, you can ask about product as a career, how that fits into different kind of functions within the business. I've had the good fortune of running almost every function in most organizations, in different organizations. So I can probably give you kind of my perspective on how product fits in from that perspective. But what I thought I'd do is give you top 10 lessons that I've learned being in Silicon Valley. None of these are original, so these are all plagiarized. And so if you find good ideas, the goal over here is to make sure that you can actually spread them. So that's what I've tried to do over here. So I'll go through a quick top 10 style, and there's an 11th one because this is a special audience. So I thought I'd give you an 11th one at the end if you folks want, or you can say, stop at 5. All right, so let's get started. So just a quick kind of overview on Box for those of you that aren't familiar with Box. Do you need me to stay within a certain range for video? I'm good? Okay. Just for those that aren't familiar with Box, we're a cloud content management and collaboration solution. We're based in Redwood City itself, and we have about 92,000 customers. That number is very hard to keep updated on the slide because every quarter it changes. And it keeps going up. So we have our earnings call coming up on Monday, and that'll actually definitely go up at that point in time. But we have 92,000 plus customers, about 70% of the Fortune 500. We've got about 65 million users that use our service. Intuit, we're fortunate to call them a customer of ours as well. And I am a customer personally of Intuit. So I think there's a quid pro quo over there. Some of our customers include some of the major brands across a multitude of different, kind of industries. So whether it be regulated industries like financial services or life sciences or, government to retail and banking to, across the board. So we have a fairly broad horizontal product. And the interesting part about this company is we have the same product that serves an organization with 3 employees that also serves an organization with 400,000 employees. So you've actually, from a product management standpoint, it's a pretty interesting problem to solve because you've got this one SKU that goes all the way through the entire kind of span of segments of customers. And that has its own set of challenges that you have to kind of think through from, what features do you prioritize? How do you go out and listen to customers? Which segments of customers do you listen to? So on and so forth. And then the other thing that's really interesting about this is it's also probably the only product I know of in the market that actually sits on 2 of Gartner's Magic Quadrants. So we sit in the Enterprise Content Management Magic Quadrant and also the Enterprise File Sync and Share Magic Quadrant. It's the same exact product that actually goes across both of those. And so I'll walk you through a little bit of the complexity that we have, from that perspective as well. So with that, let me actually start out with, the lessons that as you start thinking about product and building world-class product, at some point, all of you taking the time to come over here and learn from each other, there's probably a common passion, which is we all want to build great products. It's also pretty apparent as you live your daily lives that there's really badly designed products in the world that constitute the most part of the world today. And so if we can contribute to not having that be compounded, it would be a good thing. And so these are some of the lessons that actually help us actually make sure that we build better products than ones which start to create, kind of frustration for people. So let me start with the first rule. And the first kind of rule that I think about is the Cardinal Rule. That's probably the most important one as we start thinking about, the right mindset to go into building products with, which is you have to pick, picking the right problem to solve is 90% of the hard part. And then once you pick the right problem, getting the solution is actually only the 10%. So make sure that you pick the right problem to solve. And there's actually a great saying by Sam Altman. Sam Altman actually talks about this very articulately, which is the quality of the problem that you end up picking is directly proportionate to the success of the outcome. And it's a very counterintuitive kind of thought, which is the harder the problem you pick, the higher the probability of success. And the reason for that is because the harder the problem that you pick, the better the team that you're going to attract towards solving the problem. And when you have a great team solving the problem, that's when you actually have higher likelihood of success. So make sure that you don't pick moderately, easy problems to solve, because those aren't the ones that are going to go out and get the right concentration of talent to come kind of flock towards that, right? And if you think of what most people tend to do is they will try to de-risk by actually picking a relatively easy problem. You want to pick a problem that's actually hard, but solvable, and then make sure that you actually have a fair amount of, if you look at the concentration of talent, even in Silicon Valley right now from the companies, if you look at companies like Tesla and Google, they picked really hard problems to solve when they started solving them. And that's why you saw a huge amount of engineering and product talent that actually started, kind of gravitating towards that. So that's the first kind of rule that I keep in mind that I would encourage everyone to think about is, what is the problem you're solving? Is it the right problem? Is it a problem that people are willing to pay money for? Is it a problem that people recognize that is actually a problem for them? Is it a mainstream problem? The other thing that we think about when you're solving a problem is make sure that you're building painkillers, not vitamins. Because when you build a vitamin, there's a huge amount of kind of price sensitivity that comes into play. But when you build a painkiller, people are willing to pay for it, right? I mean, and if you just think about this, if I just had a surgery and I had to get some kind of painkiller like Vicodin, I don't really care how much it costs because I just want the pain to go away. So I'm going to go ahead and buy that if I have to. But if my vitamin cost goes up by 10x, chances are I'll just switch my vitamin to something else. And that actually applies to software just as much as it does to kind of drugs. So, make sure that you're building painkillers as much as you can. Vitamins are good, but in order to go out and be successful at vitamins, you have to have massively broad distribution scale. Otherwise, it's very hard to go out and build. So that's rule number one. So far, useful? Yeah. Rule number two that we think about very deeply at Box is you got to make sure that you only focus on things that are 10x better than what the market might already have. So if you think of something that's 20% better than the market, chances are you're not going to have people actually find it motivating enough to move from what they're using to your new solution, because they aren't thinking about your product all day long. They're thinking about their problem all day long. And if your solution is only 20% better, the inertia of just staying with their own thing is going to be far greater than the compelling need to go ahead and move to something else because it's far too much friction to move. So if you don't think of something that's at least 10x better, then don't bother going out and building it, because chances are you'll actually find anemic level of adoption for things that are marginally better than what you might have in the market, right? And this is it's a pretty important rule because we as product managers might get very caught up in thinking, 20% better is worth it. And be honest with yourself intellectually on this one, because you might think it's 10x better, but the reality is the value is perceived by the user. And so make sure that you're getting the validation from them, not based on what you think. So that's rule number 2. Rule number 3 is you got to build experiences that people have some kind of an emotional reaction to. You can't just have things that people are just going to, cerebrally appeal to, because that, by the end of it, is not going to, get a viral loop going. So this is, once again, a great, kind of thought process by Sam Altman, who I think is one of the most profound people in Silicon Valley. If you haven't, if you haven't followed him on Twitter, you should, because he used to be the president of Y Combinator until recently. And, he had this really interesting kind of saying, which was, I would rather build a product that few people love than a lot of people like, right? And the reason for that was actually very interesting. It was because he wanted to build products that were at scale, that could be used by many, many people. But in order to effectively and truly build a product that can be truly taken to scale, you have to have a component of virality, where people talk about it to each other. And the only time that people talk about a product to each other is when they love the product. So if you don't build a product that people love, they're not going to talk about it. If you don't have a product that people don't talk about, then they're not going to actually get you to a level of broad enough distribution and scale. And so you'll actually never be able to get a product to scale if you don't focus on a group of people that love it. And then from there, actually starts to spread out. So make sure that you build experiences that people are emotionally charged with, not just cerebrally charged with. That's a pretty important kind of thing to keep in mind as you're going through it. Point number 4 then is, and this is one which is pretty well understood in Silicon Valley, but the moment you go east of Fremont, most people don't understand it. And this whole notion of product market fit, where you have to build a product for a market that is a big enough market where you can go out and provide a solution that's going to create a meaningful enough amount of value that if you take away the solution after a certain amount of time, you would actually find a sense of loss from the user when you take away that solution. Their lives got meaningfully degraded. And you have to make sure that that stage is achieved before you start thinking about going to scale with your product, right? So the first thing that you do when you're starting to build a product, especially a V1 product that you're going to be building, is obsess about getting the product market fit. If it's a V2 and beyond product, you have to obsess about maintaining product market fit. Because just because you got product market fit doesn't mean that you maintain product market fit. You can lose it pretty easily. So get to product market fit, and once you get to, we think of it as 3 major stages that a product goes through. The first one is you achieve product market fit, or maintain it if it's a subsequent version. Phase number 2, you want to try to get a repeatable selling motion. Especially as you go into enterprise software, you want to have some level of repeatability in the selling motion. So if you build something and don't have repeatability, then it's going to be very hard to scale. So identify something that can be sold over and over and over again, which means the number of use cases that you're going to try to target is going to be very few. Anytime that you start thinking, I can do anything with this product, means that most people are going to do nothing with that product. Right? And so be very, very precise in what it is that you're going to be able to get done with the product. Pick a few use cases and get to be really, really good at those use cases so people love using your product when they're using that use case. That's phase number 2. Once you've got to product market fit, identify a repeatable selling motion. Know exactly how you're going to sell it over and over and over again. Once you've gotten to phase number 2, phase number 3 is get to scale. If you try to get to scale before you've gotten to phase 1 and 2, all you have is a leaky bucket. And what you're doing is you're building a product that no one really finds that valuable, that you haven't really gotten to a repeatable motion, and you start hiring capacity for distribution in whatever way you're going to go out and hire it for distribution, and you'll actually find it's just wasted money. You're throwing it out the window. So until you get, and this has to be sequential. This can't be parallelized. So it has to be sequential. And every single time you go into a company, they'll tell you, most people that actually are product managers believe they've achieved product market fit, but very few actually do, right? So make sure that you're not fooling yourself, and you've in fact gotten validation from enough number of customers that not only have I solved your problem, if I take this away from you, your life's going to get degraded, and you are willing to pay money on a recurring basis for this problem that you're solving through a solution I'm going to deliver to you. That's a pretty important thing to keep in mind. Number 5 is retention is the primary vector that drives growth. So this is actually similar to the previous point, which is until you've gotten product market fit, make sure that you don't scale. But retention is a pretty important component, which is, does everyone understand what a retention curve kind of looks like in a product, right? So you want to make sure that a retention curve doesn't asymptote to 0 when you get to D7, D14, D21. So you want to make sure that people are keeping on coming back to your product. And one of the best things that was advice that was given to me was by this guy, Alex Schultz, who's a good friend of mine who works at Facebook. If you, by the way, get a chance to listen to his lecture on Stanford, he had a course on how to start a startup that Sam Altman had run that he actually taught a class in. It's probably one of the best lectures ever on growth. And he talks about this whole concept of retention drives growth. And the particular point he makes over there is if you don't deeply understand why people come back to use your product, you're premature in going out and trying to acquire more users. So deeply understand with a small group of users why they'll come back to using your product over and over again. Once you've understood that reason, then make sure that you invest in a growth acquisition funnel, right? So retention drives growth. And then number 6, which goes in that same point, is in order to drive growth, when you get to the stage of growth, like the first piece is get to product market fit. Who do you focus on as users to get to product market fit? You always focus on power users, people that are going to use your product a lot. You want to make sure that you delight them. When it gets to getting to growth, you want to make sure that you don't ignore the marginal user, the occasional user, the one that actually does not use your product on a daily basis. How do you make sure that you keep them coming back? Because when you get to the first 100 users, it's okay to focus on the power users. When you get to the first 1,000 users, maybe it's okay to focus on the power users. When you want to get to the first 1,000,000 users, it's not okay to just focus on the power users because it's the marginal users that will actually comprise a large percentage of the pool of population that you want to go out and attract, right? And so make sure that you're actually focusing on the marginal user for growth, because if you, by definition, by default, all of us product managers are power users of our own product. So this is probably one of the hardest things to do, because what ends up happening is, as a base instinct, you as a product manager are going to want to go out and build the thing that you have instinct for. You say, these are the 15 things that I see broken in the product. So I'm going to go out and fix them, right? But the challenge is, you might go out and fix them, but the people that actually have never used your product might actually have a very different set of reasons for why they don't come back, rather than the ones that use your product a lot. The other thing is the people that are using your product, let's say you've got 5% of the user base that uses your product a lot, 95% that doesn't use your product a lot. The 5%, they're going to come back to you regardless. They're using your product on a daily basis. They're going to come back. Yeah, they like one feature or the other, and you have to make sure that you keep giving that to them from time to time. But they're going to keep coming back. The 95% won't come back if you don't give them a reason to come back. So you got to focus on the marginal user and make sure that they can actually be pulled in. So, a great feature for focusing on marginal users is notifications. So for example, if you have a notification service in your product, how you construct the notification service so that your marginal user can be pulled into the product is far more important than your power user finding it annoying, right? Like they can use filters, they can shut it down if they want to, but the marginal user might not even know to turn it off. So default state, super important. If you don't have the default state set right, you might actually see the big difference between 100% growth and 10% growth. So defaults really, really matter, right? Number 7 is how you structure the organization in product is super important, especially as you start getting to scale. So humans intrinsically are motivated by a ton of autonomy, right? And they want to make sure that they can control their own destiny. And so what you want to do is make sure that you can create a level of atomic units that can control their own destiny, rather than having large bureaucratic organizations and teams, because what that does is it actually crushes your soul. You don't want to go into work because you just feel like once I go into work, I'm going to have to just do bureaucracy 90% of the time. So what we've followed is Amazon's kind of mantra of 2 pizza teams. How many over here have heard of 2 pizza teams? Right, a few of you. So for those of you that don't know, 2 pizza teams are basically a kind of model that Amazon uses, which is you don't want to construct a team that's larger than can be fed with 2 pizzas. So 8 to 12 people in size. And the moment you go larger than that, the reason for not going larger than that in a team is because if you have 40 people in a team, most of the time is going to be spent in keeping aligned rather than actually getting work done. If you want to have teams that are 8 to 12 people in size, and then when you have scale that happens, have many, many more two-pizza teams, but don't start creating teams that are 200 people in size. It's just very hard to keep them coordinated. You'll spend most of your time in coordination rather than actually building, you know. And once you've got those teams constructed, the way that we do it at Box is we will make sure that each one has a local mission. And that local mission has to actually tie to the global mission of the company and to the product team. So, for example, we use this model called PPOD, which is essentially a acronym for the different roles that a team should have within it. So I'll just walk you through them. So the first P stands for product management. So it's what specifically do you want to have for a product manager or a group of product managers? Maybe in some cases you might have an inbound product manager and an outbound product manager. You might have a senior junior pairing, whatever you want to have. But the first P stands for product management. Then E stands for engineering. A for analytics. The second P for program management. Now it's pretty important to segment out product management from program management. There's about 7 human beings on the planet that know how to be super creative and super organized, that know how to run the trains on time. The remainder of humanity don't have those skills in the same person. So you want to make sure that you actually separate them out as roles, because the people that know how to run the trains on time typically aren't the ones that can be the most creative, and vice versa. So, and that's not a good thing or a bad thing. And you should not aspire to try to be both, because reality is you're going to have a natural superpower in one area and not so much in the other. So try to make sure that you actually, find the people who can complement you in the area that is not your superpower. So the second P is for program management. O is for online growth. And then D is for design, right? And that typically would construct a pod. Now, does every pod at Box have all of these roles? No. There are sometimes you don't need an online growth role. Sometimes we might be short on a designer, that a designer might be split between 2 teams. But what we try to do is make sure that we have some level of a construct where these roles are present within a pod. And once you have these roles present in a pod, then they have a local mission. And what you try to do is make sure. Now, the problem with this model, though, and we suffer from this all the time internally, is when you have this kind of pod model, dependency management gets to be very, very difficult, right? So like we are currently launching a workflow product. The workflow product also needs a task service, but it also needs a notification service, and it also needs a metadata service. So there's 4 teams that have to coordinate to make sure that they can actually ship a product on time, right? And so there are some of those kind of areas where we have to have an extreme amount of program management that needs to be put in place. But at least each team has a mission. One person's going to build the best task service that they can possibly build. The other one's going to build the best notification engine they're going to possibly build. Third one's going to build the best kind of rules engine they're going to be building. And then the fourth one's going to build the best metadata service, and then we'll kind of pull them all together. But each one of those are independent pods that actually are codependent on each other, but they have their own local mission. That's how we kind of build it. So that's defining the core organization unit, super important. Number 8, how do you hire people in the team? What do you look for? I personally feel like, in at least interviews that I do, I look for 2 things above all else, which is hunger and curiosity. And I personally feel like, you can have all the other things that you're going to look for, and you have to. Like, you have to look for intellect, you have to look for technical skill, you have to look for, do they have some level of relevant experience in the area? But none of those trump the fact that someone needs to have a fire in their belly, and someone needs to make sure that they actually are innately curious about the state of affairs in the world. And they're always willing to question, why is it that people are working this way, and why shouldn't we actually think about it differently? If you don't inherently have those things, and by the way, hunger, very hard to teach people hunger. It's very hard to teach people passion. You can teach the other stuff. It's very hard to teach them hunger. So make sure that you find someone. Now, by the way, hunger does not apply uniformly across all. So if I'm going to go out and have 7 recs that I'm hiring within Box, different teams might have different criteria for hunger. Because one person might be really hungry to make an impact in one particular team, but in another team, they might actually not apply at all. So you have to make sure that you're assessing for hunger in context of what you're trying to hire for, not just generic hunger. Generic hunger is good, but I think like it's very, very nice when the hunger is localized to a specific mission. And if you can have a personal attachment to a mission, it actually creates a huge amount of kind of lift in the way that individual can contribute to the purpose of the team. So these are the two I look for. I'll give you a couple other examples of mentors of mine who've given me, some ideas. And there was one recent dinner I had with the CEO, and he gave me a really interesting kind of way to think about this. I asked him this question. I'm like, what do you look for in people when you hire them? And he paused for a while, and then he said, all of us are pretty proud of things we've done in our lives. It's when the quotient of pride exceeds the quotient of curiosity that I think you've got the wrong mix. Because your curiosity should always exceed pride. It's such a deep, profound answer, right? And so think about that when you're looking at people. The other one that was really interesting that someone had given me was, this one of my first bosses at EMC. I was negotiating compensation with him over a dinner table. And I was moving from Chicago, and I'd said, "Hey, Rick, I'm going to come over, and I'm going to do these great things for you, and you got to pay me a lot of money." And he just smiled, and I said, "I don't understand why you wouldn't pay me money. I've got 17 years of experience." And he looked at me and he goes, "Jeetu, you don't have 17 years of experience. You have 1 year of experience 17 times over, and that's very different from 17 years of experience. So if you want 17 years of experience, come work with me for a year, and I'll give you 17 years of experience." And he wasn't lying, because when I went to work for him, I actually learned more than I did in my first 17 years in the job running my own business. We're working for this guy. He was just one of the most amazing mentors. His name is Rick Devenuti, and he used to be CIO at Microsoft. Anyway, so he was one that actually gave me this rubric. He had said, so I look for 4 things he had told me in people. First one he said he looked for is you got to have passion. And his whole point was you can't teach passion. You have to have it. Number 2, you have to have intellect to be able to get the job done. No point hiring someone who's not that bright. Number 3, though, he said, is you have to make sure that the person has integrity. He's like, now, you happen to hire someone who's passionate and dumb, it's okay if the integrity quotient's not that high. But it's really dangerous when the person has high intellect and has low integrity, because they can do some pretty bad things. So make sure that you assess for that. And then number 4 is you have to have the ability to get execution done through influence. So if you don't do that, then you're not going to own everything that you're going to, and this is particularly true in product management. You're not going to own everything that you're going to go out and have to influence. So those were kind of pretty interesting areas. But I've stuck with hunger and curiosity as my rubric. Number 9, the half-life of a product in this age has shrunk dramatically, right? And so the life of a business model of a company is about 7 years at this point. The average time that a company stays on the S&P 500 is about 15 years. It used to be 75 years, just like 50 years ago. So what you're starting to see is that the level of disruption that's happening in every business model is actually accelerating, and that's actually starting to shrink product cycles. So your product cycles start to shrink from it. You don't have a 3-year product cycle now. You have a 3-month product cycle. And what that changes for you is the kind of technologies that you need to use in your product so that you can go out and have a rapid iterative cycle and you can go out and deliver something within 3 months means that you can only focus on the things that are going to be your core, and anything that's not your core differentiator, you have to make sure that you partner with someone else, right? And that's a very different way of thinking about a product than the way that you would think about a product historically, where I would build the entire stack by myself. Right now, you'd actually make sure that you want to partner with for 90% of it and build 10%. But that 10% that you build, you should be the world's best at building. And if you didn't build it, the world should look different if you didn't end up building something. That's the way that you think about, as a half-life shrinks of products. And then lastly is purpose really matters in what we end up doing. So most of the times, it's kind of a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like when you first come into the workforce, you just want to prove yourself, you want to make some money, there's some basics that you want to get met. And as you spend more and more time, and especially all of us that are lucky enough to be in one of the best parts of the world to go out and be in tech, you tend to find that it's actually, it's really important to understand the intrinsic reason why you come into work every day after you don't have to. And I think, so I'll give you an example, and I'll close with this. And then, is this useful, by the way, to go through? Was it worthwhile? Okay. You would tell me if it wasn't, of course, on camera. I had gone to India after about 24 years, and I hadn't been there in a while, and I met this guy at the Taj Mahal. So I'd taken my 8-year-old daughter over there, and I met this guy at the Taj Mahal who was like our tour guide. And he was going to give us a full tour of the Taj. And for those of you that don't know, it's one of the big monuments of the world. And so he gave us this tour, and while he was giving us this tour, people would walk by. And the thing about this guy was he knew his product really, really well, which was the Taj. Like, he knew every single detail about the product. I don't know if he was making it up or not, but it sounded pretty good, right? And so we were just kind of encapsulated by him. And then every single time there'd be a couple from a different country that walked by, he would actually say something to them for a meaningful amount of time in that language. So he spoke Mandarin, he spoke Russian, he spoke German, he spoke Italian. At some point in time, I'm just thinking, dude, like, how many fucking languages do you speak? And he goes, well, I speak 8 different languages. And these weren't like, dialects of Indian. Like, oftentimes, even though India is not just different dialects, they're all different languages. Some of them, if you speak one, you might be able to understand the other. This one was completely different. Like, they're all kind of very different languages. And so I said, how'd you pick it up? He's like, well, I picked it up in a very simple way. I just, every single year I would decide to pick up one language because this is my business. So there are tourists that come from all parts of the world, and it's probably arrogant of me to think that they're going to speak in my language. And so I need to make sure that I can actually adopt to them, right? And so I think to myself, and I'm like, wow, this guy made about 1,700 rupees a month, which if you divide by 60 is nothing, right? And so about 300 rupees, about $300 a month. And so there's hardly any money that he was making, but he was this really bright guy. And so I was thinking to myself, I'm like, if you compare this guy to any one of the people in Box's sales teams, I think this guy could run circles around any one of our salespeople. And he could definitely run circles around the executives that we have in Box. Me included, at least me to start with, right? Really bright guy, really deep thinker. The only difference between us and him was we have a platform and he didn't, right? So he didn't have a platform to go out and do things in a pretty meaningful way. And we were privileged enough to have a platform. So when you have a platform, I think it's our responsibility as a community to make sure that we make the most out of the platform and do something that's actually got some deep level of mission and purpose. Don't just do things for the sake of doing them, because I think it'd be a wasted life. So whatever you end up doing, make sure that you find your own purpose in it, and whoever you end up hiring or having join your team, make sure that the purpose and the mission align for that person's aspirations versus what you folks are trying to do. That's when you'll actually get the best out of people, and that's when you'll actually build the best products in the world. So that's the highest level. What I have one other bonus one if you want, and then we can let it go if you want. What do you think? Go? All right. So the bonus one, so anyone who wants to take a screenshot, these are the ones, but I think you can get it online. But the bonus one was one that I actually stole from the concept from Airbnb, but is one that's a pretty profound one as well, which is, in order to do things that scale, you have to start by doing things that don't scale, right? So that you can eventually sustainably scale. And I'll give you an example of what we do at Box in this particular area. So we have this kind of process called F10 program, which is kind of a flagship 10 customer program. And anytime we have a V1 product that comes out, we focus a lot on the first 10 customers. How do you make them flagship? It's not the first 10. It's how do you get 10 flagship customers that are going to talk about you emphatically to the world? And in order to do that, what you might have to do is you might have to be in a very non-scalable way engaging with that customer. So if that means that you need to have 2 engineers fly out to them so that they can get the installation done, or they can go out and work with the product and have the right kind of templates built out or whatever they need to do, that you'd go ahead and make that investment. The reason for that is because if even after providing the white glove treatment, you can't get 10 customers to speak kindly about your product, the chances of you being able to do that at scale are almost zero. So you have to make sure that you start by doing things first that don't scale and validate the fact that what you've built is in fact the right thing that's solving a problem. Once you've got that, then worry about scale. Back to the first point that I was making. So pretty important that you actually get that down right. So in order to go out and scale exponentially, make sure you start by doing things that don't scale, and then you can eventually scale. So that's so with that, I'll hopefully that was useful. I'll open it up to questions, and we'll go from there. Yeah.
Yeah, and the way this works, we have mic runners. So if you don't have a mic, don't ask a question. Wait for a mic. So here you go. Go for it. Okay.
So thank you, Jeet. This is very helpful.
Yeah.
So the thing about scaling, bringing something that doesn't scale, that's very interesting. When you build something that doesn't scale, like, I'm assuming that providing the support that these 10 customers need, going out of bounds for that, and
That's right.
doing that and stuff like that. But then the expectation remains, right, even when you go at scale, that you would keep that NPS and all that other things that you're built for this group. So then how do you solve that that gap?
Yeah, I think what you have to do is, the reason you're not scaling is you're learning firsthand from them what it's going to take for them to go out and have a tremendous amount of experience with your product. Once you've understood that, ideally you're incorporating that into your product so that there's a compounding effect, and then people are starting to find a level of value that's being extracted from the product. So the first is you do it, because if you don't do it, you won't get the first 10 customers to talk about you. But the second reason is because you're going to learn a tremendous amount on what you need to build in your product that gets automated, so that you can then eventually serve customers at scale at hundreds of millions of users, if ideally if that's what your business demands. Yeah. Great. This is a great audience. By the way, one other thing I forgot to mention: we are definitely emphatically hiring at Box. So,
Okay, that's great. Yeah. So your first one, what are some of the methodologies that you're looking for in picking the right problem to solve?
Yeah, it's so that's a great question. And the way that we think about it is, you want to make sure that you're, in our case specifically, like at different stages, the companies might have different methodologies, right? So if you're you're a startup that's just gotten started, the way in which you pick a problem is going to be very different from if you're someone like Box at $700 million in size. It was very different from if you're someone who is $5 billion in size, so on and so forth. Or it's very different from a $10 million company. So I'll give you maybe a couple ideas for each. I wouldn't call it a methodology really, but I'll give you a couple ideas for each. And by the way, this is more of an art than science. At least so far. I haven't been able to crack the code into making it scientific, but if someone figures it out, let me know. So in doing a startup, I think the ones that I've seen that are most successful are ones where the individual founders who are doing a startup actually have a problem that they can personally relate to deeply. And you hear this a lot from people who've actually started something. I had a problem and I wanted to solve the problem for myself. Because the advantage of doing that is you actually know firsthand whether it actually caters to the user, because the user is you. Now, you might be a certain class of user, but at least the user is you. So you'll actually know what the problems are for which you're willing to pay, not willing to pay. As you get bigger, that luxury doesn't always remain. Because as you get bigger, you have to keep in mind that the problem you solve has to actually align with the distribution channel that you have for your product. Because you have to make sure that your route to market for distro is actually aligned with the products that you're building. Because you can have 3 amazing products, but if they go through 3 entirely different channels of distribution, you might not succeed at all 3, because you won't have any kind of scale in the business itself to go out and push the product to market. So for example, at Box's case, what we have to do is we have to look at what the near adjacencies are and where are the problems that actually get concentrated, which are huge problems because of which people simply can't get jobs done, right? Or because of which, like, markets have been created, and those markets are actually serving things in a very inefficient way. One of the easy ways to go out and look at it as you get bigger is which markets have not innovated for a very long time? Which products do you hate that actually are pretty close to your core? And are those ones where you can actually create and inject a 10x efficiency factor? And that tends to be a very effective way to go out and identify things. And then the third thing I'd say is, which I kind of mentioned, is make sure that you're aligning the product to as few routes to market as possible. Because the number of distribution channels that you have, there's some people that might think if you build it, they will come. The reality is most products actually have to get distributed through a very, very intentional way. It's never an accident when someone gets to $5 billion in revenue. I promise you that. Like, there is a level of methodical thinking that happens in how the distribution happens, or you'd never be able to get it to that scale. And so make sure that you're aligning your routes to market so that you don't have too many routes to market. I'll give you an example. If your route to market is to sell to a CIO, don't build a product that is then going to be sold to a VP of marketing as a separate product, because that might require an entirely different sales force. You won't get any leverage from the way that you're distributing your product to your current product line. You'll have to go through somewhere else. And so that's pretty important to keep in mind, is keep your route to market in mind. So one, keep in mind that you don't want to go beyond 1 or 2 degrees of adjacency. Number two, keep in mind that you're out to market. Number three, and the most important one, is the one that I said first, which is pick people who can identify problems that are as personal to them as possible, so that they can start thinking about this in a way that's very, very deeply personal to them, because they will actually keep iterating on it and they won't get tired. It won't be work for them, because they will feel like, if I don't solve this problem, my life is incomplete, not that my job is incomplete. Those are the kind of people that you want in those jobs.
Yes. Hi, Neong here. Thanks so much for sharing. There's a lot of wisdom in your speech. I just wanted to ask you 2 questions.
Yeah.
One, you talked about the P-pod model. You said there was a strict separation between product managers and program managers. There are organizations where product managers play a huge role in program management, which don't have program managers. How would you kind of work around that?
I think you have to be, those organizations can't hire product managers at scale. That doesn't mean they can't hire product managers, but if you wanted to go out and hire 50 product managers or 25 product managers, it's just very hard to find them. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but the more you scale the business, the more you want to make sure that you break down the roles. Because people have natural superpowers, and you want to make sure that you align them to their superpowers. And typically, most people don't have 2 superpowers. Almost definitively, most people don't have 3 superpowers, and they typically don't have 2 superpowers that are at different ends of the spectrum, right? And so you want to just keep that in mind as you're going through it. So that means if you actually don't have budget for a program manager and product manager, you'll have to make sure that you find those very rare people that are super organized and yet super creative with product ideation, or make sure that you hire them with much more of a program management bent, and then have someone who's more creative and idea-driven to kind of supplement them, or vice versa. Make sure that there's someone who is, on the engineering side, the engineering manager is much more programmatic. So you can divide up the responsibility in either way. You just need to make sure that there's someone who's keeping the trains on time that does it because they love doing it, and there's someone who's creating new stuff that does it because they love doing it. And typically, try not to give people too many jobs that they don't love doing, because they're not going to be the world's best at doing the jobs they don't love doing.
And another question was about think 10x that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So if you start up, you can think 100x, 10x, like there'll be fewer issues. But if you're working for a large corporation, I think my experience is that large companies tend to be a bit more risk averse than startups. And how do you kind of pitch this 10x idea to a management team who has grown up in a different kind of climate from those who grew up in a startup kind of?
So I think the biggest myth over here is that 10x is more risky. It isn't. 10x is less risky. 20% better is more risky, because the chances of someone moving over to you because you're 20% better is far riskier, because now all you're depending on is your power for distribution and brand. You're not depending on the product to move them over. You're depending on the power of distribution and brand. Now, I will agree with you, though, that large companies, it's very hard to actually have them start thinking 10x. And actually, there is a very credible business model, which is a fast follow, right? Which is, I'm going to see someone else do it, and then I'll fast follow on that one. And as companies get larger, oftentimes you might find that a few of those companies that get larger wait until someone else has figured it out, taken the risk, gotten product market fit, achieved minimum level of scale, and then said, okay, now I'm going to pick this one up and then get it to hyperscale. So that is a very viable business model. I personally feel, though, that if you're thinking from a product manager standpoint, you should at least have a feature or 2 that is meaningfully differentiated enough that the person that you're competing with does not even have an incentive to counterattack you. So I'll give you an example. When Netflix went after Blockbuster, 50% of Blockbuster's revenue came from late fees. What Netflix did was they said, we don't have late fees, we have a subscription model, right? There was no incentive for Blockbuster to combat that by actually saying, I'm going to go out and solve this problem, because 50% of the revenues came from it. There's literally an unwillingness on their end to go out and even attack the problem, because it would be detrimental to their business if they did that. And so then it takes a very special kind of company that actually says, I'm going to disrupt myself before someone disrupts before someone disrupts me. And most companies just don't operate that way. And the classic definition of disruption is, by the time you see something coming, it's too late, right? And so you've actually, the train's left the station already. You can't do anything about it. And so you want to make sure that you've identified structures and models that allow you to go out and at least have a couple of vectors where you can meaningfully differentiate, where you create asymmetry. So I'll give you another example. When you're trying to displace an incumbent in a market with someone else, you want to make sure that there's some level of asymmetry that's created. And that asymmetry, what it does is, if you just go out and replicate what someone else had, chances are they're not going to move to you. The world doesn't need yet another kind of company that's just like something else. The world needs something that's very, very different. So if you create asymmetry in the buyer's mind, it actually works. I'll give you an example at Box. So we are trying to go out and displace a bunch of companies, all the enterprise content management companies that haven't innovated in like 20 years. One of them is my previous employer, Documentum and OpenText, and you look at SharePoint, and there's not a single user that says, "Oh my goodness, I love waking up in the morning. I love SharePoint." Like, we just don't know them, right? And so if you want to go out and displace them, you don't have to replicate every capability of SharePoint. But what you have to do is make sure that you build a few capabilities that are entirely different from what SharePoint provides. So for us, for example, we said, well, what's changing as a condition in the market right now? Well, one of the things that's changing is the boundary condition is changing, where most organizations don't just work with people within their organization. They work with people outside their organization pretty frequently. And they need to share and collaborate with people outside their organization. So we actually created this capability for extended enterprise sharing and extended enterprise workflows and extended enterprise metadata. And every single thing that we do is extended enterprise. And that allowed us to create asymmetry compared to someone like SharePoint who didn't have that. The second thing we did was we said, well, what's a structural limitation that Microsoft has that we wouldn't have? Well, one of the structural limitations is Microsoft has a stack that they go out and tell people to buy in its entirety, right? And they package it all up together and say, this is what you can buy. Well, now let's look at what we could do to go out and combat that. Microsoft would say, you don't need to buy Zoom, you can buy Skype. You don't need to buy Slack, you can buy Teams. You don't need to buy Box, you can buy OneDrive and SharePoint. You don't need to buy, and on and on and on. You don't need to buy Salesforce, you can buy Dynamics. And what we said was, well, actually, wouldn't it be better if the companies that were going out and doing just one thing and becoming experts at that would do that so well and then all integrate with one another, that would actually be a much better stack to go out and own, rather than owning a stack from a single vendor where everything is going to be based on a least common denominator. So what we did is we said, let's early on in our business invest in opening up our APIs and integrating with everyone, right? And so Slack and Zoom and Teams and Office 365 and G Suite and iWork and Salesforce and NetSuite and Workday, all of them work with us. And as a result, we created a condition which was a best-of-breed condition. We said that the world's going to move to best-of-breed. And there was not that much incentive for Microsoft to go out and say, yes, we are also best-of-breed. They can't do that credibly. Why? Because in every single one of those best-of-breed components, they would actually have a competitive element where there's a kill sheet for that company internally that their sales team is getting trained on. So it was actually just a way to create asymmetry and make sure that you build something that the counter positioning was such that they wouldn't be able to go out and credibly compete with you on that dimension. So that's a dimension that you would always be known for, and your brand would be created around that dimension. Oh, I'm sorry.
So talking about hunger and curiosity,
yeah.
How do you screen candidates for that? I mean, what kind of questions would you ask? How would you know that they're not just there for the interview answers, but something that will last longer?
Yeah, this is, I think in most of these things, if you are able to convey to the candidate, firstly, that by, let me actually start with a couple different areas. It's always interesting to get the history of the individual and what drives them and motivates them. And then try to see if that maps to the area where you need hunger, right? And so it's not like people are hungry or not hungry. People are hungry for doing certain things and not others. And I think the way I think about it is, even if you come and interview at Box, you're going to be great for certain teams and terrible for other teams. That doesn't make you a good product manager or a bad product manager. It just makes you a good product manager or a bad product manager for the team that we're going to interview you for. So, and we've tried so many times to say, you know what, we're going to just have general purpose hiring. We're just going to hire a bunch of product managers and they can go into whatever team they want to go into. Like Facebook does that really, really credibly. I haven't found a way of doing that effectively, because like when you think of a back-end product manager and you think about someone who's on the front end, they have different sources of energy extraction for the way that they get excited about the day, right? And it's just kind of a way that you get excited. So the first thing that we do typically on questions is I typically ask a question, which is, what do you want to do in life and why? And it gives me a lot about the person, because they pick the direction of the conversation that they're going to go into. And then when you could keep drilling down on that conversation, the next level of detail, you'll know every human being is hungry for something. Like there's very few people that are not hungry for anything at all. But the ones that they're hungry for, you can actually find that out by letting them guide the path of the conversation rather than you guiding it. If you go with a very, very long list of questions saying, I'm going to ask you these 15 questions, I don't particularly think you'll actually get from them what you're looking for, because what you want to see is how their brain navigates. So the way I think about it is, there are two areas that you want to go out and assess for. One is, what things have you been exposed to? And second one is, what things have you actually produced results in, right? Neither of those get solved by interviews. That can be solved by looking at the resume and doing a back channel reference. The thing that gets solved in the interview is, how do you know what motivates this person, what makes them tick? And once you have that conversation for an hour and just focus on what makes them tick, if that's your objective, rather than trying to go out and assess. So in your interview cycle, always have one person who's interviewing the people that tries to figure out what makes them tick. And that person has to have a good instinct for people. And once you do that, I think you'll just kind of feel it at some point in time for the particular domain or the area. Because a very good question to ask is, why do you want to be in this area and why is it important? And by the way, I haven't found that many great liars in my life. So if you just ask them the question authentically, and it's not like positioned as an interview question, chances are they're just going to give you an authentic answer, and then you have to just take them for their word anyway. I think the interview cycle and process is imperfect by definition. Like in 1 hour, the only thing I know about a person is that this person is really, really, really good or bad at interviewing. I have no idea how they're going to do, right? And so the only thing you have to do then is, after they've left, you have to do a bunch of back channel references. Don't do references that they've given you. Most of those are useless. You want to do back channel references of people that they might have worked with, people that other people have worked with, because your reputation follows you. The other thing I look for is, how soon can you start? If the answer typically is, I can start within 2 weeks, and if the answer is, I'm going to give my employer 2 weeks, you have to wonder if they're going to do that to you. I tend not to hire people that can start in 2 weeks, because chances are they're somewhere along the line, someone is getting screwed, right? Because like I don't know, but jobs at Box are pretty important. We give people, even at a junior level, pretty large jobs. If they're going to leave me in 2 weeks, like they're not going to earn a reference from me. There's a couple of questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So my question is about the F10 program. It's a very interesting concept. How do you recruit for the customers to make sure that you're not solving for a skewed audience?
That's really, really good. So we're doing this right now. And by the way, in all of these things, I'm going to give you things which seem like perfect answers, but we have not perfected the science yet. So in each one of these things, we keep iterating, as we go on. But one of the things that we look at is qualification criteria for what is the ideal customer profile that we want to have, that we believe we have built the product for, that we want to sell it to. and then try to recruit people that are similar to that profile from a qualification criteria. So what that does is that narrows the field down from 92,000 customers to maybe 1,000 customers. And then off the 1,000, we can say, okay, so in this segment, in this market, for this persona, for this kind of a set of characteristics that a customer might have, for this level of maturity curve of how they're using Box, how would they actually fit with this product? And then we actually go into that and just keep honing in. So that's one channel that we look at. The second channel we look at is we actually do a blast radius to our sales team. Go out and find beta customers. And when we ask them to find beta customers or initial customers, the first few customers, we try to not put them on a list. We put them on a waiting list to see which ones of them are in fact going to be the right ones for us to get. So like, for example, right now we're doing a Relay, which is our workflow product, beta. And we decided that we're going to do a beta with 20 customers. We got like probably 100 customers on the list. Then we picked 20 off that through a certain set of criteria based on what we thought the product was designed for, to see if there was the most amount of success the product could have. And then that included a level of commitment that the customer is going to show in making sure that they're going to participate in the beta with providing their time and their feedback. So that's a pretty important loop that you have to go through. And I mean, but it's, once again, not a perfect science. We probably screw up 5-7 of them, and then we probably get a few of them right. And then before you know it, like it becomes a loop, and then you keep kind of iterating and adding to it. Yeah. Microphone? Oh, there's a microphone. Okay. Here you go.
Hi.
So,
let's say you were the CPO of
who's speaking? Who's talking?
Right here.
Oh, there you go. Okay, great. Thanks.
Let's say if you were the CPO of Dropbox. How would you create asymmetry against Box's own enterprise product? What is your thought process?
I think there are certain things that some companies just aren't capable of doing.
Great answer.
Thanks for the great talk. My question is on the 0.7 PPOD. So when I started my company like 3 years back, I mean, it was just me and my co-founder. My co-founder became the engineering, and the rest, all the letters was me. So I was not a designer by trade, so I learned designing, and 2 years of kind of really trying to achieve product market fit. We realized last year that we screwed up on the product. And so my question is twofold. One is, how in the early stage when you're bootstrapping, how do you really get to PPOD effectively to get to product market fit? And the second is, if you realize that you have messed up in kind of first few iterations, how do you get, I mean, that's where we are at right now. We're trying to kind of recover from that and trying to kind of get the better in the design.
Yeah.
So any advices on that?
Yes, I don't think this applies to super early stage. Like if you're bootstrapping something, you're going to have a founder and a co-founder, and there are two people that are going to go out and build it. You're not going to have PPOD. Like you might have like, and then you, and so in my mind, the way that you would think about that is think about getting a co-founder that actually has superpowers in the areas that you don't have them, so that you complement each other. And I personally think it's a really bad idea to start a company by yourself without a co-founder. I also think picking the right co-founder to start a company with is super important. And if you pick too many co-founders, you can actually tend to have things go sideways pretty fast. Like Box was unique in the sense that they had 4 co-founders. 3 of them are still with us. I'm actually, 2 of them are among my closest friends. And the other one is one of the most fascinating human beings I've ever come across, who's our CFO. Like he's just like, I'm not as close to Dylan as I am to Aaron and Q because of like the amount of time that we spent together. But I think Dylan's the most fascinating of the 3 as far as a human being is concerned. But the thing is they had an immense amount of trust with each other, but each one of them were wired differently. And so if you sit down with each one of them, they tend to disagree with each other more than they agree. And I think that's a really important dimension, which is you have to agree on the values and be able to disagree on the strategy. But don't find someone that you disagree on the values with, and don't find someone that you constantly agree on the strategy with. Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Jeetu. Great talk. The third point, build experiences people love.
Yep.
In the B2B market, how do you think about that when sometimes the buying decision or the buyer is very different from actually the user? And I'm sure in enterprise market, you have faced that too.
Yeah. I think it's easier today than it was 10 years ago, because I think there's this thing that happened for consumerization of IT. I think there's the SaaS business model requires that you renew your contract every year. And in order to renew your contract, the CIO has to go out and take a survey of the users and say, do you like these things? And then they come back. So like you have to make sure that the buyer and user are both catered to. The way I think about this is it's actually pretty simple, where you have to make sure that you identify your personas and stack rank them. And then make sure that you build your product for your personas where you're actually dividing up your effort for each one of those personas. So for us, for example, the user is the most important individual. The administrator is another very important individual. The developer is a third really important individual. And then the buyer is the fourth one, right? And these are the four that we actually tend to optimize for. Now, is it a perfect even distribution across four? No, it's not. But there are times when you would actually make trade-offs, but you need to understand what the cost of the trade-off is. So sometimes you might say, this might be bad for the user experience, but it's going to be good for the buyer, so we're going to go ahead and do something. On the other hand, you might actually find some things which the buyer is really asking for, but it's going to be so bad for the user that that's something that actually violates your values. And then you're not going to do that. And you're going to just make sure that you stay away from it. And so that's the piece that I would actually tend to think through. And in my mind, I don't think it's hard to find a synergy between the user and buyer if you actually frame it in the right way. Because the buyers are actually buying something so that eventually the users can be productive so that they can add value to the company. But there's a time scale difference. When the buyers want something versus when the user is going to have something might be different. Yeah.
Paul Graham talks about something called a quantum of utility, where you've introduced something that's fundamentally new. So at an early stage, something that I think about is, for an early stage company, is something that, like if you don't own the whole product, let's say you build that quantum of utility, but it's based on some things that you don't necessarily build yourself. Mm-hmm. How do you think about like when it's important to build those things yourself versus?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And that was what I was talking about a little earlier as well, which is like, do you build the entire stack? Do you build a portion of it? And I'll give you an example of, I think Uber did this really well, where they, when they started, they had a very, very specific view of the world of what it needed to look like. But they said, I'm going to make sure that I have my mapping software from Google. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to have my payment software from Stripe. I'm going to make sure that I have my messaging software from Twilio. And I'm going to pull it all together. And what they unmistakably did was they curated the experience for the customer, but they had all these microservices that they stitched together. So if you looked at the number of lines of code that Uber actually wrote in the first version of the product compared to what the value was that they had, it was actually very disproportionate. The value per line of code that Uber had in the first version of the product was very, very different, right? Over time, Maps became a very strategic asset for them because they had to collect data so that they could become self-driving. I don't know firsthand. I'm just assuming that's the case, right? I don't work at Uber. But so what they did was they said, well, at this point in time, I'm going to go out and start to have my own mapping service. And at some point, you might actually take something that was not as strategic to you at that time that became strategic to you later, and you're going to move it over. Sometimes you might move it over because you've gotten to a level of scale where literally you might, like, Dropbox did that when they actually moved their data center away from Amazon into us. Now, we've done the exact opposite approach. We've actually started with our own data center, and we've started using a combination of us in the public cloud. Like, there's different philosophies that you might have, but over time, it's either economics that will drive you to move as you scale, or it's either going to be that something that was non-core to your value became part of the core as your business model evolved. And so you have to just keep in mind what's actually core to your business that's going to differentiate you versus what's essential to your business but not core. That's actually going to be there for the sake of, like, your system has to run really well, but that doesn't mean that that's what's going to differentiate you. And so I'll give you an example. Like, when Allstate Insurance builds an insurance app using Box as a content service in the background, they don't want to become a content management service, but they need to make sure that the content management service works flawlessly when someone takes a picture of a claim and uploads it, right? And so they use us for that. They use our platform product that's white labeled into their app. And that actually is a classic example of it. Something that's essential for their product to work, but something that they don't actually ever aspire to be, which is a content management system. They aspire to be an insurance company. So they go out and focus on the things that are core to them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, so I had a question here.
Yeah.
Simple one. So how do you assess somebody for like out of the box thinking, creativity, when you interview someone?
Typically, I found it interesting when, like, it's very easy to assess for originality of thought, right? And if you create some kind of scenario and say, like, I'll tell you a very simple example. If someone comes into Box, and I'll give you a tip of, like, when you come into Box, if you sit with me, I'll ask you, like, what do you think of the product? And the wrong answer to give is, I think it's a great product, right? Because that means that if the job's done, we don't need you. We're game over. The thing that you want to tell us is, this is where we need to actually see improvement, and then come up with ideas that I might have never thought of before. I don't care if you got those ideas from friends of yours that told you about it. Do the work and then come up with it. Creativity or hard work are equally valued, but make sure that whichever one they are, they actually teach me something new that I didn't know about. And if I can, the very easy way I assess an interview sometimes is, did I learn something new in the past 45 minutes I spent with this individual? If in 45 minutes the individual couldn't teach me anything new that I didn't already know, how are they going to add value to my business? Because we want to not hire people that we can tell people what to do, like Steve Jobs used to famously say, right? It's like you want them to tell you what to do. So like you have to make sure that they're instructing you in some way and opening a perspective or broadening your aperture in a way that you would have never thought of. And that's the beauty about humans, is each one of us brings such a vastly different kind of set of experiences that you can come in and you can just, enhance and enrich each other's perspectives. So if you can enrich someone's perspective in 45 minutes, you should wonder whether that's even the right job for you, because chances are you probably don't have instinct in that area. So one of the things when people call me about job opportunities, right, I'll usually tell them, like, the ones I say no to categorically, or in the past have said no to categorically, are ones where I'm like, I don't think I have instinct in that area. So, like, for example, if someone said to me, Jeetu, we think you've done a great job at Box. Come and be the product manager of Snapchat. I would be the worst product manager for Snapchat. I don't understand the interface. I don't understand why someone would use that the way they do. And, it's not because the product is bad. I just don't understand it. Someone said to me, Jeetu, come in and be a product manager for gaming. That would be a really bad idea for me. I'm not a gamer. I don't have instinct. So I think you have to make sure that you gravitate to places where you have instinct and then compound that and double down on it. And you have to be intellectually honest with yourself. At any point in time, you can fool the interviewer. That won't make you successful. That's the other thing to keep in mind. Yeah.
So I kind of want to focus on picking the right problem to solve. So this is a product management kind of talk, and I come from like a user research design background.
Yep.
And I think what's really interesting about product managers, especially in enterprise, is that you have multiple customers. It's not the consumer, which is the user. But as a product manager, you said that they're kind of like the power user, but the marginal user about 95%. Now, I think that's a really interesting kind of tension, because you're trying to design for people who are not you. You're trying to start solving for problems who really aren't you. How can you see past the bias of your lens to really pick out the right problems to solve? And also that is kind of an added complexity, because usually in my experience in research, the problems that people are telling you are the problems are rarely the problems that they're actually facing. It's actually something different.
Yeah, so let's unpack that, because there's 2 or 3 questions in there. So let's first talk about, no, that's good. So the first one is around, how do you know that is a problem for the marginal user, because your instinct is to be a power user. I think the most important skill that a product manager can develop over time is deep listening. What is it that the user wants to do? And then what you have to do is parse from that what they think they want to do versus what they actually need to do. And then it's your job to make sure that you can provide them with alternative solutions to do that piece of it. But on the marginal user side, the right questions to ask a marginal user would be, how come you haven't come back into product X for a while. Oh, I don't know. I've actually started working on something else. I didn't have time. I got busy. What would actually make you want to come back over there on a daily basis? What things in the product would be needed for you to come back on a daily basis? And you're not looking for the answer. You're looking for their train of thought and how they're thinking about it. And that's where I feel like it's people lose the plot because they keep looking for the answer, and then what they'll do is they'll get the precise answer and say, oh, this user said this is what I needed, or user research said this is the feature that we need to build. Frankly, I think after user research, the judgment call on what you build is always the product manager's. It is not something that research won't just spit out something. Like I think you have to, like here's a negative downside of the consumer product management area, which is it's, especially in the consumer side, you can actually look at data very closely and then just translate back, this is what the data says, so this is what I'm going to do. I think in enterprise it's slightly different, where you have to make decisions based on 70% availability of data, not 100%. And then you have to use 30% instinct. And so what you need to get to is the lion's share of the way there on user research by finding out what it is that customers actually are tripping up on. And then you have to use your 30% judgment to say, if I did this, would that actually solve the problem? And then parse out from there that they're not just being polite to you by saying yes, which actually happens a lot in user research. Like if you would you buy this? At some point in time, people just don't want to be mean to other people. So what I would do is I would actually really focus on making sure that you're asking questions 4 different ways, just like when you do a Myers-Briggs test or something. The same question gets asked in 4 different ways, so you just literally can't lie your way through it, or you can't just be polite about it. You have to actually get to the root cause. So I think asking questions, making sure that you can you can take out the bias that people might have, or the influence that you can have if you're a very compelling product manager to make someone think, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. Like you have to make sure during the user research phase you're not selling your product. You're actually genuinely just trying to get the research, and then the sale of the product happens once you built the product. At that point in time, shamelessly sell. But until then, don't. So that was one. Then the second question you had was, there were 2 things packed in. One was
about the marginal user and how you're not the marginal user.
Yeah, I think I answered that, right?
And then it's like, I think you also answered the right problem to solve, because usually what people tell you is the problem is
not. Yeah, and by the way, I do think you should always search for problems, not have people just tell you what those are, and you should almost never ask for a solution from the user. Like that's not their job. It's your job as a product manager to build a solution. It's their job to tell you what they struggle with. And when they tell you what they struggle with, don't take them at their word. Double click and triple click, or double tap and triple tap, whatever you want to do, and make sure that you're kind of drilling down to a level of detail where you can validate that what they're saying can in fact be something that's not just a recency bias on their end. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Jeetu, back here.
Yep.
Thanks so much for this talk. I'm particularly interested in your 5th point about retention, and I want to know how you think about in terms of a relationship with activation. If people don't activate, if people don't stick around, they don't see the perceived value, then does it make sense to just focus on activation, or should you focus on activation and retention at the same time?
I think it's, to some degree, it is serial, right? Because if you don't have activation, if your bottlenecks are largely on the activation side, you have to focus on activation before you can actually get to engagement. And so, in my mind, there's activation, there's engagement, there's retention, there's resurrection if you need to have at some point in time when people have left and they come back to you. But on the activation side, I do think it's you don't have to completely solve activation before you start thinking about retention, but you have to solve it enough that you have enough of a sample size to understand what the retention patterns are. And I do think one of the things that most people don't understand in retention is deeply on why people, in fact, do come back when they do. Most people focus on the fact that I don't have a good enough retention curve, but what they don't understand is why people do come back when they do. Because what you want to do is understand why people come back, the ones that do, and then try to multiply that, rather than keeping on solving the problems on why people drop off. So it's like, where do you focus? Do you focus on the areas which are already working, or you focus on the areas that are actually not working? Yeah. Microphone, hang on 1 second. Oh, there's a microphone, and then you're next. Okay.
Okay, my turn?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Hi, Jeetu.
This is a great audience. This might be the best audience I've ever had. Usually no one asks me more than 2 questions. They're like, all right, you're done.
So first of all, thanks for coming and for sharing the magic formula on how to build product leadership. My question is that as you've explained to us the path on how to do this, a lot of this has to do with your capacity as a leader to be able to smell opportunities, understand the users, be able to hire the right people, create alignment, etc. Could you share with us a bit about how you developed yourself into a leader and what were some of the key things that happened along your career path, that maybe 2 or 3 of them, that helped you reach this level of capacity and competence to be able to understand these sort of roadmaps?
Oh God, how much time do you have? It's going to take a long time. What'd you say? Yeah. So let me actually give you my deep kind of bias and passion that I've had. So I grew up in India, and I moved here when I was 19. And I was inherently hungry because I was like literally hungry in the sense that we had gotten to a state of like extreme poverty, and I had to take care of my mother who was in India. And so like, you didn't have choice but to make money. So like you had to focus on that. And so that created this level of hunger. And so as a result, I'm always, there's a saying that's there, which is dark to dark. Like you want to be the first guy that starts to work. And like no one should be able to tell you that you don't work hard enough. Because I categorically know I'm not the smartest guy at Box. So you have to be the hardest working guy to be able to make things happen. So that's one, which is I had an intrinsic benefit of having some circumstances in my life early on because of which I was just naturally hungry. The second thing that happened in my life that actually was super useful, which I think you folks are older and have gotten to this point, you're all successful, but I worry about like what happens to people like my daughter who's 8 years old. And the thing I worry about the most is like, is she going to be inherently hungry? And the thing that is interesting about that stage is there's a time in your life where there's a light bulb that goes off that says, if I focus on something that I really want to do, I probably am smart enough to go ahead and do it. And then it just becomes a matter of choice of where you want to go out and place your bets. And that, I think, was probably deeply profound for me during my time when I moved here, because when I moved here, I was a terrible student in India. I was like a really bad student. I came here, and all of a sudden, I decided I'm going to be really good, and then I got straight A's for the first, few years in college. And then I started my own business, and then the grades went down again. But, during that time, it gave me confidence that I could do anything I want to do. The other thing I used to have was I used to stutter as a kid. And so I started waiting on tables at a fine dining establishment called Sizzler. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but it's quite classy. They have like a $1 average tip per table. But in that establishment, I was very nervous the first few days when I was there because I used to stutter. So I used to stutter on the word hello. I couldn't say the word hello. And as a result, like, how do you break the ice? Like, how do you say hello to someone? Like, that's what you start with every sentence. And so that job made me overcome that fear. And so those were probably the seminal moments in my life, was waiting on tables, service industry. It was not like, oh my goodness, I found this amazing code that I wrote when I was 12, and it was then that guy just fell in love with computers. No, it was a pure necessity for survival, coupled with, making sure that you could overcome some challenges, and then getting enough confidence in yourself that you overcame some of your fears. And then I think Chris Cox had positioned this really well. He's probably one of the most fascinating humans I've met in my life, was the ex-CPO of Facebook. I would probably say the most interesting human being I've met in my entire life might be Chris Cox. And he had this really interesting kind of comment that he had made to me. He said, the thing with product managers that's really important for a leader is you got to give people feedback without killing their confidence. Because once you kill their confidence, product management's all about confidence. And by the way, on that, I'm only 50% there, because my personality, as some of the boxers might tell you, I can tend to be very intimidating in a room because I tend to appear more certain than I actually feel. And so what happens is they confuse my certitude for aggression. And then before you know it, like you tend to, veer people the wrong way and not make them feel safe. But when you can make people feel safe and when you can give them feedback but make them feel confident, I think that's the best sign of being able to get people to reach their full potential. And I think I had enough mentors early on in my life that did that with me. So I would say those were probably the seminal things in my life that shaped my my piece.
Thank
Yeah.
you for sharing.
You bet. Yeah. I could literally do a talk on that because there's a lot of things fucked up about me. Yeah.
That's extremely valuable
Yeah.
because so many people talk about the success for successful formulas. And many people are sitting in the audience wondering how did they arrive to the point to have the instinct to be able to derive these formulas, or how did they have the instinct to be able to pick up these pieces and assemble the puzzle, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a big mystery for people. That's my area, which is executive coaching, development of talent.
Oh, right.
Just to understand how do people, grow into that person, right? And
Right.
For people to really gain value out of this, they also have to understand how did you also arrive at your journey.
Yeah. I also think 90% of arriving at a journey in a place like this is dumb luck. You're luckier than you're talented. Take it for granted. And the second thing is, don't think you're too good because you live in an environment of extreme scarcity. So don't confuse scarcity with excellence. Be humble enough to know that you're probably extremely lucky to be in a scarce environment for talent right now. Like life's much worse when you're not in a scarce environment for talent. Sorry, there was
I'm more concerned about the thinking 10x. Okay, so when we have a different set of problems that we are trying to address, and we classify them into must have,
nice to have,
and nice to have. So at that point of time, and we always prioritize the must haves, and there is very less inertia towards thinking about a strategical point of view and thinking about 10x. So how do we, and second thing is like, we can't even quantify how much these new features are going to impact, because again, that depends upon the product life cycle. If it is a starting very new product, then we don't know anything about and we can't do too much testing on it. If it is a too grown, then we can't test on new, we can't test new waters at that point of time.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? How do I bridge that gap?
Yeah, so in my experience, if you don't have at least one or two 10x features in the product, I think it's very difficult to dominate a category, and it's almost impossible to create a category if you don't have a 10x vector in the product. And by the way, the people that get disproportionate reward with market share are the ones that create categories. And so there's a great book called Play Bigger. If you haven't read it, you should read it. That just talks about how do you create categories, and the one that creates a category actually gets a lion's share of the market, the first to create the category, because you then write the playbook against which everyone compares to. And so I think it's very hard to do that without a 10x feature. So if you've just built capabilities to try to replicate a solution that someone else has, but you haven't built something that is intrinsically remarkably different, you don't have to always be better. You have to be meaningfully different. If you don't do that, then I just don't think then you've built the wrong product. So it's not a question of how do I prioritize 10x versus the must-haves. If the 10x are not in your must-haves, you've got the wrong list. You have to have at least a couple must-haves, a couple 10x's in your must-haves. Otherwise, you've got the wrong list. Because why would someone come to you? It just wouldn't make sense. The reason people bought Tesla was not because of the placement of the cup holder, which is what most Americans used to have as number one criteria for buying a car. The reason people bought a Tesla, no, it's true. This is actually true. In America, most cars prior to Tesla were purchased because of the convenience and placement of the cup holders. That was one of the top 3 categories that people used. I think in the first version of Tesla, they had either really shitty cup holders or didn't even have cup holders. But no one cared because they had something that completely reimagined the market. I really hope they succeed, by the way. I'm rooting for them.
Hello. So I keep hearing this a lot of times that if you cannot build a particular product or if you don't have the expertise, then you try to, buy somewhere else or you partner with other companies. In my opinion, partnering with other companies is more of a business development, activity. And for a product manager who really cares about their product and wants to basically is like her, they're basically, I would say, hungry for making sure that their product is successful. Would you recommend them to just do the business development activity? Because if there's no if there's no BD person, would you recommend that, okay, they just go out there and try to find somebody?
Yeah, like if you don't have a person, then you just have to be scrappy and do it, right? And that just means you're in a different stage of a company and you should just go ahead and do it. I don't think that partnering should translate to you don't care about your product. In fact, partnering translates to you care about your product so much that you're only going to focus on the things that you can affect the most, and everything else you're going to partner about. Because there are other people that can do it better than you, and that is not your core competency, and that's not something that you want to go out and create your market. And you've got very constrained set of resources, and you're going to place your bets on the most important things that you know you can make a difference on. So absolutely, I would actually, if I were you and you didn't have a BD person, then I would pick up the phone and call whoever you want to partner with and go ahead and partner with them.
Okay.
If you have a BD person, I would still make sure you're instructing the BD person on where to partner, but let them do the transaction.
Got it. And kind of on top of that, when you said in the beginning, like when you're even deciding about how you want to build your product, or even like before you even write maybe in the first line of code, you start thinking about how do you want to distribute the particular product. Again, that requires understanding your company throughout and understanding again what kind of resources we have in the company for sales, for marketing, for go-to-market strategies. How well, I'm trying to understand again, according to you, how involved should a product manager be to make sure that all these things will work even before they start writing the first line of code?
So I got good news for you and I got bad news for you.
Go for it.
What do I start with, good or bad?
Let's go for good first.
Good news first. Product management is probably the most leveraged job that any company will have. It's going to have ripple effects on every other function in the business. And everything originates from product, at least in modern day companies, especially the ones that are in Silicon Valley, or even elsewhere. But I think that most companies are focused on product. So that's the good news. The bad news is product management doesn't own too many functions, but they have to go out and influence literally every function in the business. Like you have to influence how SKUs get created with order management. You have to influence how pricing happens. You have to influence how sales happens, how marketing is done and positioning is done, how engineering builds the product, how design thinks about the product. All of those things you have to influence. You don't own any of them, right? But the ripple effects, if you do a poor job influencing them, the blame is entirely on you. So that's what should motivate you about being a product manager. That should also be the thing that says, oh my goodness, this seems like it's the wrong thing to do. I should get out of it. And so you'll very easily fall in one or the other. But in my mind, I think that's the most exciting part of product management, is you can actually go out and learn human psychology at a level that is so profoundly deep. And you learn business on an end-to-end basis. Like you understand it's not just how you make the sausage. It's how you make the sausage, how you put it in the bun, how you package it up, how you put some ketchup and dressing on it, how you then take it to the cart. Like every single step of the way, you actually think deeply about what that's going to do. And everything starts from the essential value in the product. Now, by the way, if those things on the latter part, most products that fail don't fail because the product is bad. Most products that fail don't fail because the reach is not realized in the product. So do not ignore go-to-market as a product. Like I personally feel like there's two things to keep in mind. And in fact, I need to update this deck a little bit because we've started doing this now. There is a product market fit component and there's a go-to-market fit. And the go-to-market fit is very different from product market fit. And go-to-market fit is all about finding and winning opportunities in a repeatable way over and over and over again. And if the product manager hasn't thought about it, you sure as hell can't go out and expect your salespeople to think about it. Like you have to be the one that's originating that thinking.
Thank you.
Market fit comes after product market fit.
It comes before you take it to market, but yeah, you want to think about it right at the same time in parallel, because like if you don't think about it right up front, you'll build a product, then you need to jam into your go-to-market engine. Like you want to make sure that your product is built for the go-to-market engine that you have access to, or the one that you want to build. Like it makes no sense if you want to have a product-led, kind of innovation and then hire direct sales people. Like for example, how you would build out your entire kind of sign-up flow for the product and trial flow for the product, and how people are going to go out and go through every single step of the sales process would be very different if you have a direct sales model, a channel sales model, or a web online sales model. And you got to just think about those things as you're going through the process and making sure that there's a repeatable way of not just winning opportunities, but finding them. And who are the people that are going to be the repeatable ways to find the opportunity? How are you going to go out and mechanize that?
Sorry, just again. So how much time does all of that probably take before you even so I'm actually struggling with that right now, or rather I'm in that phase right now where trying to conceptualize it, and it's taking a lot of time before we even develop the product. In general, what's your, with all the things that you're recommending to do, and that, which I think that makes sense to do, how much time does it take to even get to the stage before you can start, working on the product? And I'm sure obviously it will vary from, one product to the other, but on average, how much time do you think it takes?
I think it's hard depending on the stage of the company, and how many people you have to get along with you for the ride. But I personally feel like you will never have enough time, and if you're not feeling scarcity of time, you're just short on vision. If you're not feeling scarcity of resource, you're just short on vision, because that means that you don't have enough to do with your time or money. And so like scarcity is a good thing. Like you should feel scarcity. And by the way, best thing to feel during product market fit stage is scarcity, because that means you don't have enough money to go out and spend. So you're going to try to be scrappy and prioritize and say no. And I don't know who said it, but like most of the job of a product manager is what you say no to rather than what you say yes to.
Okay.
How are we doing on time?
We're going to take just a couple more.
Okay.
Cool?
Yeah. That's one more over here. Yeah. This is a remarkable audience. I'm like, you guys are, and like speaking of hunger, everyone wants to learn. This is great.
Hi, Jeetu. Thanks for the great talk and even greater Q&A. By the way, I rejected a car in the morning for the placement of cup holders.
You should buy a Tesla. They've actually fixed that problem.
Yes. After I get a job for you. So my question is on the 9 Half-Life. You said that when you're talking about it, 3 years to 3 months going down in that trend. So for a B2B product, like you talked for Box enterprise version, and specifically for the example you gave somewhere in Q&A about the Allstate, which is using a platform product. How true is that? And how do you kind of explain that with respect to those kind of products? Because the reason I'm asking is those products tend to be sticky, and once like Allstate has started using your platform, they are there for foreseeable life, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, the thing that we tend to have a mindset of is we always assume that when there's motivation, customers always have a choice to churn, and it's a privilege to make sure that they don't. And so I think that's the most important kind of piece of the mindset is your continuous value that needs to be added is pretty important. In Allstate's case, or if you look at a place like a platform product where you're an embedded component, 3 months might be metaphorical, and 3 years, like there used to be cycle times where every 2 to 3 years you would release a product, right? I don't think right now, if you even built a product with a mindset of 3 years, it'd be meaningful. Like it would be too late by the time you get it out. Like it'd be dated. I think 3 months might be too short. Like we certainly can't do full products in 3 months, but it takes us about 6 to 9 months to do a product effectively, and then we're trying to get it towards the 6-month mark, then the 9-month mark. And I feel like if it takes longer than that, what you have done is you haven't focused on the core essence of things. And so the thing that you want to do is get it to the core essence, and then everything else you can iterate over time, but make sure that that core essence is something you can get validation from the market within a 3 to 6 month time period. No, I'm talking about, so there's two things. One I'm talking about is the half-life of a business model is about 7 years. So that means your entire business model, how Netflix went out, and Netflix is in its third iteration of the business model. They started with shipping DVDs. Then they said, okay, I'm going to go out and do streaming media. Then they said, I'm going to build original content. Every single one of those took about 7 years. And they killed the previous business model with the subsequent business model that they had almost every time. Like the lion's share of the revenue shifted, the profit pool shifted, right? So that's what I was talking about, half-life of the business model. Half-life of the product is how long does it take for someone to take a product to market? And I think the thing that, and Dan talks about this a lot in his book as well, this whole notion of kind of making sure that you get something out fast and iterate by getting input and feedback rather than waiting for too long so that you have a waterfall model is a pretty important concept to keep iterating on, because you just simply don't know what you don't know if you're not getting enough validation along the way. So like, Reid Hoffman has a great kind of line, which is, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you shipped it too late. I think it's a great line. I think in enterprise, it's a little hard to do, but like in general, it's a good kind of framework to keep in mind. Like if you go completely in the enterprise and say, Goldman Sachs, I'm going to ship a product in security and I'm going to be deeply embarrassed, they'd kick you out in a heartbeat. So.
All right, we have a lot of good Q&A. We're just going to do one more question on the mics, and then we'll give away the books, and we can hang out and do Q&A after that.
Hi, thank you. And I got two questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So one is...
it's going to cost you double.
Yeah. You don't have to answer the second one. So going to 10x, so everybody is agreeing on 10x and providing asymmetric positioning and differentiation, yet I'm amazed at the staggering success at cap-hailing apps, so clones, cap-hailing apps, delivery services. They're not always the best. They're not always the better,
they're fast followers.
Yeah. Despite a huge market.
Yes.
It's just still amazing that they purely produce the clone, they're still able to get the market share.
So I personally feel like every single value that you have here, there is probably, for most of them, and we have this thing that we're building right now that we're just about codified, that we're going to roll out in the next few weeks, which are Box's product principles. And we're going to actually have them publicly available, on the web and everything as well, so everyone can take advantage of it. But the key thing about, anything like this, which is a framework or a value or something like that, is there's always a counter value that is also a viable way to go out and pursue something. It's just the way that I've chosen not to do it. So these are my lessons I've learned in life that are the most effective for me. So for example, like I said earlier, fast follow is a very viable business model. Actually, Microsoft built the world's most valuable company with that as one of the core essence of it. They're fast follow. They've never been the ones that actually go out and create something. But they've had this power of a monopoly and distribution power and all of those things that really help them out. And that actually works well for them. But if you're a person that enjoys being the underdog and enjoys making sure that you create something fresh and from startup to, let's say, $1 billion in size, I think fast follow as a strategy is actually a very dangerous strategy. Because you have to be, you have to have, when you have a fast follow business model, you have to have something that they don't have. So you either have to have a massive price advantage where you can go out and build something for much cheaper, or you have to have a massive distribution advantage. If you don't have either price or distribution, then it becomes very hard to go out, or you need to have a massive access to market. The third strategy that works pretty well in that is Tier 1 providers are in certain markets. They will start with the US, they'll go to EMEA, they'll go to Asia, and then you might say, you know what, I'm going to go out and start with all the countries that they might not go to first, and that's where I'm going to start first. That's a very valid strategy for a fast follow, right? Another good strategy for a fast follow that happens a lot, like in India, you see a lot of kind of, or even in China right now, where a lot of the ideas originated here, and then they actually cloned that idea for the Chinese market. And it actually worked really well because the Chinese market had nuances that were very different that they actually went out and focused on that market. In my mind, that's a 10x in the sense that that's actually catered to a market and that's created a value for 10x. But I do feel like fast follow is a very credible business model, not something that gets me excited. Like I have a hard time waking up in the morning saying, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to copy the 3 things that this other company did, but in a record time limit of 2 months, and then delivered in the market, and that's what's going to get me excited to work hard. I just don't feel like that actually. Yeah, well, although I will say Facebook has probably innovated in a lot of areas that other people haven't. They just didn't on the stories front with Instagram. But a lot of other areas, like you got to give Facebook a lot of credit. Like that is a remarkable company that probably right now is getting the short end of the stick because of media and press, but they've done some pretty amazing stuff. Now, by the way, there's also some things that they have to fix on the privacy front and all of that, but like if you think about just pure innovation, kind of velocity in that company, it's actually staggering to see at that scale that they've been able to do it. So with that, I think I'm getting the hook. Thank you so much for being so engaged.
Yeah, thank you for all the great Q&A in addition to the talk. Let's give Jeetu a big round of applause.